While we are all familiar with the role played by the United States and the European colonial powers, there is little discussion of the role Africans themselves played. And that role, it turns out, was a considerable one, especially for the slave-trading kingdoms of Western and Central Africa. There are many thorny issues to resolve before we can arrive at a judicious gesture to match such a sustained, heinous crime. Perhaps the most vexing is how to parcel out blame to those directly involved. Hello, and welcome to Black Discoveries. Today, we embark on a journey to uncover a crucial and often misunderstood fact: Africa's role in the slave trade. This chapter in history is complex and painful, and it's vital that we explore it with depth and sensitivity to understand the truth behind it. To truly understand Africa's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade, we must delve deeper into the African context of the time. It's a story of diverse cultures, kingdoms, and societies, each with its unique dynamics and interactions with European traders. Africa is not a monolithic entity, and it's essential to recognize its rich diversity. The continent was home to an array of ethnic groups, languages, and belief systems, from the Yoruba in West Africa to the Zulu in the South. These varied cultures had different ways of life, economies, and systems of governance. In addition to the transatlantic trade, there was a long history of trade within Africa itself. Different regions specialized in various goods, such as gold, ivory, salt, and textiles. This inter-African trade network predates the arrival of European traders and was a vital part of the continent's economy. As European powers began to explore Africa's coastlines, they sought to establish trade relationships. Initially, they were more interested in goods like gold, spices, and textiles. It wasn't until later that the demand for enslaved labor became a dominant force in these interactions. One critical factor in Africa's involvement in the slave trade was the introduction of firearms by European traders. The allure of these new weapons was a game-changer for some African kingdoms, as they could gain an advantage in conflicts with rival groups or expand their territories. It's important to acknowledge that the decision to participate in the slave trade often depended on local power dynamics. Some African rulers and elites saw an opportunity to strengthen their positions by collaborating with European traders. This often came at the expense of rival factions, further deepening divisions within African societies. The transatlantic slave trade is undoubtedly a complex issue, and its roots run deep in the interplay between European powers and various African kingdoms. It's important to avoid painting Africa as a single entity that willingly participated in this inhumane trade. Rather, it's a story of diverse experiences and motivations. We must resist the temptation to oversimplify Africa's role in the slave trade. Africans were not passive actors, nor were they solely responsible for the immense suffering that occurred. Instead, they were part of a much larger, interconnected system driven by economic interests, power struggles, and the brutality of the time. As we explore Africa's complex role in the transatlantic slave trade, it's important to remember that we are delving into a painful and difficult chapter of history. This history is not meant to assign blame, but rather to help us understand the intricacies of the past and, ultimately, humanize the experiences of those who lived through it. Now, let's delve deeper into the European side of the transatlantic slave trade. To understand the extent of Africa's involvement, we must examine the European demand for labor and the complex dynamics at play. The European colonization of the Americas and their emerging agricultural and mining enterprises created an insatiable demand for labor. As sugar, tobacco, cotton, and other crops became major cash crops, European colonies required a vast and inexpensive workforce to meet their production goals. The profitability of slave labor cannot be understated. Enslaved individuals were considered a valuable commodity, and their labor contributed immensely to the economic growth of European colonies. This system allowed Europe to amass great wealth, but it came at a horrific human cost. European slave traders and merchants played a significant role in perpetuating the transatlantic slave trade. They established trading posts along the African coast where they acquired enslaved Africans in exchange for various goods such as firearms, textiles, and alcohol. Perhaps the most harrowing aspect of the transatlantic slave trade was the Middle Passage. Enslaved Africans endured unimaginable suffering during the voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. They were packed like cargo in the holds of slave ships, subjected to inhumane conditions, and often deprived of even the most basic necessities. While European powers were responsible for the demand that drove the slave trade, its impact on Africa was devastating. The trade disrupted local economies and communities as valuable resources and labor were diverted to the slave trade. Additionally, the introduction of firearms exacerbated conflicts within African societies. It's important to note that many European powers justified the transatlantic slave trade through a distorted lens of racial and cultural superiority. This dehumanizing view allowed them to morally justify their actions and perpetuate a system of cruelty. Over time, there was a growing awareness of the inhumanity of the transatlantic slave trade, and abolition movements gained momentum in Europe and the Americas. These movements would eventually lead to the abolition of the slave trade in the early 19th century. European involvement in the transatlantic slave trade is a dark chapter in history that cannot be understated. It involved not only the traders and merchants, but also European governments, which established regulations and systems that allowed the trade to persist. If you're enjoying the content and finding it valuable, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more amazing videos just like this one. Welcome back as we continue to explore the complex role of Africa in the transatlantic slave trade. In this extended segment, we'll delve deeper into the multifaceted aspects of African involvement, including the slave raids, capture, resistance, and the enduring legacy of this dark period. To understand Africa's involvement in the slave trade, we must acknowledge the unfortunate reality of slave raids and capture that took place within the continent. African kingdoms and groups sometimes engaged in capturing individuals from rival tribes or prisoners of war. One driving force behind these raids was intertribal conflict. Competition for resources, power, or control of trade routes often led to violent clashes. Some groups took captives in these conflicts and subsequently sold them to European traders. It's important to emphasize that the level of participation in the slave trade varied greatly among different African societies. Some regions actively engaged in the capture and sale of slaves, while others were less involved or resisted these practices. However, it's equally important to recognize the many African communities and individuals who actively resisted the slave trade. Resistance took various forms, including efforts to protect vulnerable members of society and defiance against slave raiders. Communities like the Maroons in the Americas, who were descendants of escaped slaves, often engaged in guerrilla warfare against European colonizers. In Africa itself, there were instances of communities fighting back against slave raiders and offering refuge to escaped slaves. For example, the Kingdom of Congo, one of the African kingdoms involved in the early stages of the slave trade, eventually sought to restrict and control the trade as they realized its devastating consequences. Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba actively opposed Portuguese colonization and the slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade left an enduring legacy on the African continent. Beyond the immediate social, economic, and political consequences, it has shaped the trajectory of African history and continues to impact the region to this day. The slave trade often disrupted traditional African societies. Valuable human resources were diverted away from agriculture, industry, and local governance, leading to instability and economic challenges. Additionally, the transatlantic slave trade had lasting effects on the African diaspora, including the loss of cultural ties and the dispersal of African peoples across the Americas. This legacy of forced migration continues to influence the cultural and social fabric of many nations. The legacy of the transatlantic slave trade is not confined to history books. It continues to impact issues such as systemic racism, economic disparities, and cultural identity in Africa and the diaspora. As we navigate this complex history, it's crucial to promote understanding rather than assign blame. Africa's role in the transatlantic slave trade was influenced by various factors, and it's essential to approach this topic with nuance and sensitivity. Reflecting on this dark chapter in history allows us to acknowledge the suffering of those who endured the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade, while also recognizing the resilience and strength of those who resisted and survived. We hope that this extended exploration of Africa's complex role in the transatlantic slave trade encourages respectful dialogue, education, and a deeper understanding of the historical forces that shaped our world. As we conclude our in-depth look at Africa's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade, we must remember that history is not just about the past, it informs our present and future. By acknowledging the complex and multifaceted aspects of this history, we can better appreciate the profound impact it has had on the world. We encourage you to continue learning, engaging in discussions, and seeking the truth about historical events. Like the transatlantic slave trade, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel to support our mission of promoting informed dialogue and understanding. Thank you for joining us today on this extended journey through history. This is Black Discoveries. Until next time, let's continue to explore the past to better shape our future.